Yeah, I saw it. Yeah, I saw it. Hey, Paul, I don't have to run the meeting. You're here. Let's do it.
That's right, okay, we're adjourned. No, I'm serious, I was looking for that.
There's nothing to say.
Really?
Really, it's. Hey, Paul, I don't have to run the meeting. You're here. Let's do it.
That's right, okay, we're adjourned. No, I'm serious, I was looking for that.
There's nothing to say.
Really?
Really, it's. Hey, Paul, I don't have to run the meeting. You're here. Let's do it.
I'll take this as an. Let's call meeting to order.
Paul, I don't have to run the meeting. You're here. Let's do it.
Let me, again, call this work session to order.
Paul, I don't have to run the meeting. You're here. Let's do it.
Let me, just call it to order. You didn't hear me?
No.
Again, call this work session to order.
It's a repeat.
Oh, okay.
Paul, I don't have to run the meeting. You're here. Let's do it.
Let me, just call it to order. You didn't hear me? You mess with me now, Bill. Again, call this work session to order.
It's a repeat.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that, Joe.
Paul, I don't have to run the meeting. You're here. Let's do it.
Don't repeat that, Bill. Let me, just call it to order. You didn't hear me? You mess with me now, Bill. Again, call this work session to order. Oh, okay. Sorry about that, Joe.
I'll sit back here.
We got it under control now.
Paul, I don't have to run the meeting. You're here. Let's
Don't
do
repeat
it.
that, Bill. Let me, just call it to order. You didn't hear me? You mess with me now, Bill. Again, call this work session to order. Help us with that. Oh, okay. Sorry about that, Joe. That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to help the record. They couldn't repeat it, though. See, I thought so too.
What's wrong with their stuff?
See, I thought Bill kept repeating it.
Move back here so you see it now.
All right, now we'll officially call the meeting to order. Can I ask Kirk, Ms. Black to call the roll for attendance for this work session?
Malinowski.
Here.
Hughes. McBride.
Here.
Livingston.
Here.
Teratio. Joe Walker. Barron. Here. Overture Walker. Mackey. English. Newton.
Thank you very much. The purpose for the work session today is to go over the land development code review. I'll turn it over to staff now.
All right, thank you, Mr. Livingston. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. And we did provide everyone a printed copy of the presentation. Should be in front of you as well. So, Mr. Chair, as you just mentioned, wanted to just do a quick overview of the land development code rewrite. So in terms of the, I guess, process of how we wanted to go through this presentation today, was really just providing a brief overview of kind of the process and the objectives that we've had throughout this rewrite. And then we wanted to really go article by article, really giving a high-level overview of each. And then at the end of that article, show what those changes are that the Planning Commission was recommending from what the draft was back in April. And so that is ultimately those recommendations from the Planning Commission is what we are asking council to take action on Tuesday on the 28th. And so at the end of each article, we definitely want to leave room for any questions or comments or points that council wants to address within that article itself. So if you have things in Article 1 that you want to talk about, we want to leave and try to address those as we're discussing that article versus waiting until the end and having to kind of go all the way back to the beginning, if you will. And so let's see here. So ultimately, the land development code rewrite is something that we've been working on over the last 4 years. So the rewrite started back in February of 2017. And so that was the kickoff meetings that we had during that time. And so ultimately, we've really been working on this for quite a few years now. And with each different phase of the rewrite itself, we've had various community input points throughout that time. So as we did the code assessment, as we did the Module 1 draft, as we did the consolidated draft, we have had stops along the way for input and engagement to hear concerns as well as address any questions, and then ultimately doing that same thing with this public hearing draft, most recently with various meetings out in the community. And so ultimately, what the Land Development Code rewrite is doing is overhauling and replacing the existing land development code. So we don't want to necessarily think of this as just an amendment or an update to our current code. With the amount of changes and differences between the proposed code and the current code, we feel it's significant enough to where it is going to be something entirely different. It is going to allow for development that we can't necessarily accomplish within the current code during this time. So we feel it's going to be something that is going to be ultimately different in a variety of different ways than what the current land development code is. So we're ultimately looking at this being something entirely new versus being just a simple update or revision to the current. And so with the rewrite, we have really established various objectives that we've been looking to accomplish as we have gone through this process, and what we are hoping and what we feel this new code is achieving. And so one of the big things here is looking at creating a more user-friendly code. And we'll see some of these things as we go through the presentation, pulling graphics directly from the code itself into this presentation. So ultimately, making it more user-friendly where it's more graphically rich, but it also has a lot more plain language versus legalese, and is a much more user-friendly, approachable setup than what we currently have within the code. And then ultimately, as this is an outcome of the 2015 comprehensive plan, looking to directly implement those policies through the land development code itself. And so, where we have different policy direction from the plan, we can implement those through the code itself. And then also looking at other objectives, aligning zoning districts and uses with current best practices. So this is where we have a lot of zoning districts that are outdated. We have a lot of zoning districts that are ineffectual and don't really achieve what they're intended to do or allow for development that we really are wanting to see and that the community is wanting to see in a variety of different ways. And so ultimately, this also coincides with bringing development standards into the 21st century. So a lot of the language that we have within our code is similar to some of the language that we had back in 1977 when we originally adopted zoning in the county. Similarly, when we did the most recent major revision in 2005 to the Land Development Code, we still have a lot of those standards that at this point are 15, 20 years old, if not older. So a lot of the different development standards that we have now haven't really kept up with best practices or really looked to achieve the types of development that we need and that we want to see within the county. And then one of our other additional objectives is really looking at how do we green the development that we have within the county. And so looking at implementing a variety of practices, whether that's incentives or whether that's new standards that coincide with having more sustainable development. And so starting with Article 1, this really provides the basic elements of the Land Development Code. So this includes things like title, the effective date, and the purpose of the code. And so really just this article is one of those that you don't really look at a lot and people don't really think about because you aren't really doing too much with it. This is one of those things that you kind of have to have. And so it really sets forth a lot of the different elements that's in the code that kind of go throughout. So looking at things related to kind of where the basis or authority for zoning comes from. So it references the enabling legislation from the state, also sets out what all the land development code would apply to. So whether that's, private land, county-owned land, state land, homes for the handicapped, a variety of different things that need to be in there that we often don't necessarily consider or thinking about. So this is just one of those basic elements of the code that we have to have. And a lot of the language that is in here is really carried forward from the current code, but is modified and revised to where it's a little bit plainer language and includes a little bit more specificity where needed. Two of the things that I would really want to point out here to council is this is the article that references the zoning map. So one of the things that we've always been talking about is, when the remapping process is one of the things that we're still going to be doing as we look to adopt and implement the land development code. So we have the text and then we have the map, and then this is where that map gets referenced. So this is where it establishes that map textually, but then we still have to go through and actually do the mapping itself. And as we've mentioned in a previous work session, we're going to be looking to do that later on this fall, over the winter, and into the spring once we have the text in place. And another important component of this article is going to be looking at the transitional provisions. And so what this does is it establishes language for how applications that are submitted and are complete, how those continue to get reviewed in good faith once that new code is adopted. So there's basically this period in time where the new code is adopted, it's going to effect, but then items are still being processed or being reviewed under the current code. So it gives an option to where it can continue to be reviewed under that current code until a certain date, and then going forward from that effective date, anything new would have to be reviewed under the current code. So this really just sets up these transitional provisions for how things kind of quote unquote in the pipeline would be carried forward once that new code is in place. And then ultimately within this article, it looks at repealing and replacing the old land development code with this one. So there's a lot of things in here. It's a really short article. And so with this one, we don't have any recommended changes from Planning Commission. So just wanted to take a moment, Mr. Chair, if there's any questions related to this article specifically.
Just one thing I have real quick, reference Article 1. You know, oftentimes you're having individuals saying, where are the maps and so forth, not understanding the importance of the text in relationship to the map. Can you explain quickly why it's important that we do the text and then the map?
Yes, sir. So with the map itself, we talk about the map being based upon the text. And so without the text, you really can't build this map. So there's ultimately this relationship that kind of is going along there. So until you have a full text in place, as things change with the text, things would be changing with the map. So ultimately, if you're changing one thing or changing the other, so specifically changing the text, you're constantly having to then go back through and revising that map. And so the question then becomes, at what point do you stop with one thing and go with the other? So ultimately, it's easier and more effective to go ahead and have that text in place and then look at doing that mapping process. So one of the analogies that we use has been what we're doing right now is basically remodeling the interior of our house. So we're going to be painting all of the walls of our house. So right now we're going through and picking out the colors. So we know that we need this green, we need that blue, we need that black, we need that tan. And then what we're going to be doing on the mapping process is going through and saying, hey, which of these walls actually need to be this color? Which of these walls need to be that color? So right now we're picking out the colors that we know will work and will be the ones that we need. And so then the mapping process itself will be actually painting the walls. Yes, sir.
Further questions reference Article 1 information that you just covered? Mr. Mallon, you recognize it.
Yeah, we got a question, Brian, and that is, I never saw anything in here as far as definitions. Is there some area here?
Yes, sir. So definitions are now going to be found in Article 9, so near the end of the text itself. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. You may proceed.
Yes, sir. So Article 2 is going to be the administration article. And one of the things here is this really kind of deals with ultimately how things are kind of processed and ultimately kind of what the review procedures are for the different development applications. And so one of the things here that's kind of a major departure from the current code is really making it more approachable and easier to understand. And one of the ways that really results is a more graphic-heavy, graphic-friendly article. So our current code is basically just plain text and nothing but text. Here we include a variety of charts, whether that's a flow chart or a table that helps to identify, things from the summary review responsibilities. So for this type of application, who is the reviewer, who is the recommender, who is the deciding body, things like that. And then the step-by-step process of what is step 1, what is step 2, what does that look like, and how do I find that information? And so really what this does is streamlines and simplifies that review process, but also provides better understanding for what that review process looks like. So it really looks at this kind of generalized review framework and then goes into additional details for specific reviews on specific applications. So really here again, going back to a more friendly and easier to understand process in the current code, and then looking at a different overall look, feel, and approachability that we think leads to a better understanding of the everyday citizen looking to get something done. So if they know, hey, what is this process going to look like? What exactly it is that we're trying to do? And then they say, okay, I think it's this application. They can see what that process is, kind of see how long these things generally would take, but also who are the people I need to get in contact with about this thing or that thing within that process. So this is one of the articles that actually we saw a lot of changes, but in terms of Planning Commission recommendations, but a lot of those really relate to review times. So a lot of what those recommended changes were really relate to that overall review time frame. So currently within the code, we have a 30-day review, but the way that we have been operating internally is more so, I believe it's a 17, 18-day review cycle, if I'm correct, Mr. DeLage. And so there's this kind of inconsistency between the way that we were operating and then the way that the code was set up. And so a lot of the comments that we had been receiving were related to that review cycle process. So trying to make those match up a little bit more. And we feel like we've accomplished that with some of those recommendations where it's a 17 business day review cycle. So it still allows time, still allows staff a significant amount of time to review as well as how that review process looks. So that's what a lot of those changes that you would have seen on that Planning Commission recommendation sheet related to was that review time frame. One of the things here that we...
Before you get going too far,
Yes,
I'm
sir.
back here on this page
Yes, sir.
with your mini charts. Is there any way that you can take those charts and put them on a separate page? I mean, even under this bright light looking with Dollar General glasses, I cannot read these things very well. I need a magnifier. If it's supposed to be a simplified review process, we, as well as anybody else looking at this, should be able to quickly look and determine what it is without straining. And that certainly is not what's offered on that page.
Yes, sir. So these are pulled from the text itself, and in the text they are a lot larger. So that specific...
Yeah, but we're looking at this right now rather than flipping through all of this right here to try and find it, okay?
Yes, sir. Any other questions, Mr. Chair?
Questions?
Did make it a little bigger because here's one when I complained the last time, so, you know, it's gone up one font, I think.
Gotcha, Mr. Malinowski. Gotcha.
Other visual places and get your glasses next time for you.
You better buy me a pair too.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So one of the things that we noted as part of those Planning Commission recommendations, so currently within the code, and again, thinking about the Planning Commission recommendation, so one of the things that is on there under the standard review procedures is currently the way that the language is written, there is a pre-application neighborhood meeting. And so this is one of the things that is a required procedure. And so this would be for any, let's see, so it's a pre-application neighborhood meeting that would be applicable to, let's see, I want to make sure I'm getting the right applicability here. Submission of any application requiring a public hearing or for a major or minor development. And so one of the things here that the Planning Commission recommended was changing that back to an optional requirement. And so there was a pretty large amount of concern from both staff and some of the stakeholder groups as it related to this, and more so from staff's perspective is how the way that this would be implemented. One thing, because if someone, so let's say Big Bad Developer LLC is coming in to do a rezoning, you know, do we have them do this neighborhood application meeting, but also if, say, regular Joe with, you know, business to rezone, he would also have to go through and do this process. And so it's one of those things where just in terms of who all and how that gets applied, that was a little bit of a concern from staff, especially as it relates to things that were by right use. So whether that was a major land development, a minor land development, versus just things that were had to go before a public hearing, so things that council would be voting on versus things that were held administratively. So that was one of the things that we wanted to point out to council, because we thought there might be some discussion or thoughts on it, but that was one of the things that Planning Commission recommended changing to an optional requirement versus being mandatory. Yes, ma'am, Ms. McGrath.
Now, who made the recommendation for it to be a requirement?
So originally, that was things that I believe was partly discussion from staff and the consultant, because there was some language previously where it was optional for some things, there was a requirement for some things, and I think ultimately in one draft it was made a requirement, and then additional discussion, we just felt like it didn't necessarily work.
The only thing I just make a brief comment,
Please.
is that if you don't do it, then it falls on us as council members to have to go and try to coordinate all these community meetings. And that's a lot of work on us. Community people are calling us, we're making sure that we get community input. So that ends up being additional work for council members for many of the zoning issues. And I know Ms. Barron spoke on, and that she has been doing a lot of it. And there are others too. So, that would be my concerns about the work has to be done one way or another, and then it falls back on council, we don't do it up front.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's no secret how I feel about community meetings. I don't think that they should be optional. It's a level of transparency for not only the county, but as well as the developers who are coming in. And I just would like to see that we would do a better job of creating community rather than somewhat of a division, whereas I have lots of other things I'd like to do in the evenings, but I am committed to making sure that the community hears from the developers before I take a vote.
Right.
So, and I know that this pre-application meeting is somewhat different from what I've been doing, but I think that if we would put something in place and put a more structured process in place with the pre-application, then the community will know what's coming before it gets to us in rezoning. And so I'm not a real big fan of that. As it being optional, I would like for us to remain, to get some continuity and some consistency with it, as well as some structure as to what the expectation is, because I think across the board we should be doing this.
So that was one of the things that I think we were having lots of thoughts on too, because again, the way it's written in terms of it being a requirement, it would still not just apply to a developer. If I'm just a single landowner, I'm trying to rezone 0.5 acres next to something else, I would still have to provide and hold this neighborhood meeting. And so that was one of our biggest concerns. And so one of the things that we had discussion on, because we would have to treat all of the applicants the same, whether it's a larger developer or just a single kind of property owner, we would still have to treat them all the same within that. So one of the things that we were kind of thinking about was how do we then change that around a little bit, where maybe it's not necessarily every applicant, but the application type. So if you had a certain amount of acreage or the things like that, that was one of the potential options that we were discussing as maybe being kind of that middle ground compromise if we are going to a requirement, or make it, if we are going to have it be a requirement versus being optional, that we look at it being more application type based and the size of that application, the acreage, what have you, versus being the applicant itself, because we wouldn't be able to treat the applicants any different.
And I think that makes plenty sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
It does, that to look at it based upon the application type.
Right.
And the acreage when we look at that, because, we don't want to put, my daddy up and he wants to get, wants to rezone, 0.5 of his 7 acres of land, and give it to one of my sons. I wouldn't, that's not equitable. But I think that if we have, what do you call them, big bad builder, big bad builders coming with 300 and 400 acres of land that they're talking about rezoning, we definitely want to make sure, because the impact is different.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that's what we have to remember. Development is a community impact. People have been living in these homes for 40 and 50 years, and then you say, we're bringing 600 homes, and by the way, it's optional if they tell you.
Mm-hmm. So that was one of the ones that we wanted to point out to y'all, because we expected there to probably be some interest in that specific change with the pre-application neighborhood meeting. So the way that the Planning Commission was recommending it was just changing it to optional based on kind of I think it was the consolidated draft where that language was. And then we were kind of thinking as a compromise, depending on how council felt, we could look at changing that language a little bit as it relates to making it, based on the application type, then it would be a required thing at that point versus every applicant. So one thing that I necessarily wouldn't know how this would go, but, in terms of timing-wise of when we would include that change, whether that's kind of first reading, second reading, or how we did that, I think that's something that we can take a look at, and staff will get together and talk about as well.
Right.
Yes, sir. Mr. Malinowski.
And that was my question here. While these are recommended changes by the Planning Commission,
Mm-hmm.
how is it going to be determined which changes are put in, which are not? Who else has the input on it?
So I think this is the way that I think from our standpoint, because it was a text amendment, they're able to recommend the specific change. And so I'm not sure procedurally how this would go. I would probably defer to Mr. Price or legal eventually at that point. But I think the way that we were kind of looking at it was each individual recommendation, if there was something that council didn't like in regards to that recommendation, they could just strike that and carry everything else forward or what have you like that in regards to the public hearing draft and their recommendation, versus it being an all or nothing.
Yeah, and I agree with Ms. Barron on that last one, that not to make it optional based on the land usage. I mean, I got a guy that said, I want to show you what I want to do. And I said, did you talk to the community? No. I said, well, show them what you want to do first.
Right. So that's why we thought that there would be a good amount of thoughts and discussion around that one in particular. But I will, like I said, I will get Ms. Price and we can get with legal and figure out how that, would work procedurally in terms of if there was one specific change or recommendation that Planning Commission had that council didn't like, how that works. So just some of these other changes the Planning Commission was recommending. One of these in particular is the posting notice requirements. And so the change that they recommended was, rather than one sign for every 1,000 feet of property, one sign for every 150 feet of property. And so that's a big change. And so really that's kind of looking at, depending on the size of the property, that's a lot of signs. And so one of the things that we had already identified internally, and this is one of the things that we had been seeing a lot of comments and hearing a lot of comments from, not just from the community meetings that we've been having, but also just in general, and this is one of the things that we had also seen, is the way that the posting is, but more so the signs that are used, a lot of times those are a little bit of an issue. And so that's one of the things that we were going to be looking at anyway for how those signs look, how those signs function, and what the ultimate information that is provided on those signs are. Because really the intent of those signs is really to put people on notice that, hey, something is happening. You're not going to be able to stop driving down the road at 55 miles an hour and see, oh, well, what is this thing going to? What's the tax map number? What's the new zoning? What's the old zoning? And so really trying to simplify the way that those signs are set up and really overall designed to where they become a little bit more effective. So, you see a white sign and you say, okay, that's a Planning Commission thing. If I see a blue sign, that's a Board of Zoning Appeals. If I see a red sign, that means it's going before County Council. So that way when you see that colored sign, you know what it's for, and hey, I need to call the planning department. And so that's where you get your information versus trying to stop going down 55 miles an hour and see what's what. Yes, sir, Mr. Malinowski.
Brian, also, though, other locations I've been, I see as far as placing these signs, they're not placed parallel to the road on the other side of the right-of-way that maybe get somewhat covered by weeds. They're perpendicular with the road. So as you're driving, as you see street signs, stop signs, you also see this sign, and it's up at an eye level for drivers, or a little higher even. So it really draws attention, and you could come back and look. Because not, as you said, you're not going to be able to glance this way. A lot of people don't see it glancing that way because they're paying attention to what's in front of them and the other directional signs of traffic.
Right.
So I'd recommend doing it that way.
Malinowski, that is one of the things as a staff that we have been looking at a little bit more, the actual location of the signs, and I guess it falls on me, so I apologize, because I have gone out to some of the sites, and I'm like, that's not where the sign should have been. And the signs actually should be closer to the road, and in some cases, as you stated, maybe, parallel, maybe perpendicular. But one of the things that, kind of going back, I think what Brian is looking at now, is one of the things that we didn't want to, kind of harp on too much with this was the number of signs that are required. Really what we have found, you can put, say you need 10 signs, and we can put 10 signs out there, they're not effective. But one of the things that we do as a staff, and I say, as a staff, we make sure, because the one thing we don't want is to come to a meeting and one of your constituents says, we didn't see any signs. Two people say the same thing, and then as a council, you say, well, y'all need to repost it, defer it. That's not really it. What we do is we make sure we strategically place the signs where people can see them. We place them directly across from a neighborhood. So when people come out, they can see it. We make sure we place them at certain corners. It is a matter of where we place them. So one of the things we were trying to get away from was maybe one every 1,000 feet isn't, that's appropriate, but one every 150 feet, maybe, I think that may be a little bit too much. Again, unless we just take the time and make sure that we place them where people can see them.
Yes, ma'am, Ms. Moran.
I think that, we do need more signs. As you know, signs are effective. If they were not, you wouldn't have so many around when campaign season comes. So, I think we do need more signs, but that ties into, the pre-application neighborhood meeting, because those meetings would have to be posted too, so, at the time. So I think that's gonna tie in with the signage as you look at how you're gonna code the signs.
Okay. Yes, ma'am, that's a good point.
And I don't want to stay on the signs too long, but I do believe if we look at the quality of signs that we're putting out, we may not need as many. They are buried in the weeds. They and when you put them out, they may not be. But if we have a hearing 2 weeks later and we get a little rain, it's covered up, and so I would like to say, the quality of sign and the level, the height of the signs are very important. Y'all know I drive my district all the time, and I'm always pulling over on the side of the road trying to see. And literally, one of them, I had to pick it up just to see what was going on. And the other thing, the point that Ms. McBride brought up about the community meetings, I think that that Dr. Thompson and his team, they do a very good job of letting the community know when we're having these meetings, and the quality of signs that they're using is like night and day. It does get notice out there, and so if I would like for us to kind of look to have some type of consistency with the signage. And then my last point would be, as you all have been doing lots of road shows and been out in the community, I would like to, as we continue this process, to make sure that the community understands the sign codes, the colors. What does that really mean?
Right. And Ms. Barry, I think this is also something that kind of in the interim between, the ultimate effective date of this, I think this is also something that we can have the Planning Commission have a little bit more discussion on and have them work on and see what, in terms of the posting of the property, what these signs should look like. I think this is also something that we can have some discussions with them, get their thoughts on it as well, and ultimately bring something back to council of, hey, here's kind of what we've come up with and what we think may work a little bit better. Any other thoughts on this before I go on? Yes, Ms. Moran.
Just in summary, we're looking at increasing the number also, the number and the quality and the location. Those are the three areas.
Okay. So, well, one of the other additional changes here was the prior application withdrawal, and so this was one of the things as we were reviewing it, we kind of saw that there was a missing portion of this procedure. It only dealt with some aspects, didn't deal with all of them, and so ultimately we recommended to Planning Commission that a new little section to this be added, so just additional language where it was missing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the development review periods, so standardizing reviews for most applications to 17 business days. And then a lot of the language that was related to our floodplain, whether it was the permit or the floodplain overlay or things related to the definitions, I believe the consultant was working with the prior ordinance language and not the most recent language. So there was a lot of elements in there that needed to be rectified in order to keep our compliance with the national, or NFIP, let me make sure I'm using the term right, NFIP. So there was a lot of elements that were in there that Planning Commission is recommending be included that were missing. Yes, sir, Mr. Malinowski.
Thanks, Brian. The prior application withdrawal, you're going to create something and send it out to us?
It's in there already. So that language, I'm gonna make sure I find the
Any idea what page?
Section. That's what I was going to get to, Mr.
Okay.
Give me just a second.
And does the 17 business days give you at the staff level time to conduct the necessary reviews?
Yes, sir. So the way that we work internally, it's at 18 calendar day. I'm going to let Mr. DeLage take that one while I find the page number for you.
17 days is our typical time frame for our review process. So that's reviewing for completeness and then also sending it out to all relevant reviewers, and then ultimately generating either a revision letter or an approval letter. But 17 business days gives us enough because we have a review cycle that starts every Wednesday. So the deadline's Tuesday. On Wednesday, we determine it's complete, and then that's when the clock starts. But that also gives us, with 17 business days, that gives us enough time that if someone were to submit on a Wednesday and they weren't to get into the review cycle until the next week, it allows us to make that I don't want to say hold on to the application, but have it ready to go into the next cycle, and then still meet what our internal process is for the 17 calendar day review.
Let me back up just 1 minute.
I'm just trying to take care of you there.
I'm sorry. Let me back up just 1 minute. For my colleagues, starting from my far left here, just state your name and what you do at the county.
Services Manager. And we have Mr. Jensen, Assistant County Administrator. Yeah, he doesn't have a microphone.
I'm Eric Jensen, I'm the Assistant County Administrator.
And then we've got Mr. Price without a microphone, Zoning Administrator, Deputy Planning Director. And then we've got Mr. Brown, obviously, County Administrator. And wherever Ms. Black went, Clerk to Council.
Thank you.
Okay. So Mr. Malinowski, that's going to be on the Planning Commission's recommended draft. It's going to be page 2-20. So it should be section 26-2.4 N2, I believe, is what that section reference is going to be. And it should be a similar.
Okay, I'll find it on 2-20. Thank you.
And it should be a similar page number in the regular public hearing draft. But those are really the changes for Article 2. As I mentioned, a lot of what those changes we saw that the Planning Commission ultimately recommended approval upon really related to a lot of those development review procedures. The next one. So really next couple of items is going to be related to the zoning district itself. So looking at the new Article 3, so here we see a variety of changes related to zoning districts. So the big one is going to be looking at density-based zoning, so removing the minimum lot standard and retaining other size standards. And so ultimately what this does is really gives more flexibility to the way that lots can be created and designed. So rather than having this minimum amount of land that you have to have for that lot size, you have a little bit greater flexibility for how that's set up, but also ultimately how that design of that development can be created. And so you will retain some of these other sign standards such as setback and those elements, so it's not just going to be an ultimate free-for-all but you're going to have a lot more flexibility than what that minimum lot size will allow. And so ultimately, one of the things that we're looking at with the zoning districts themselves is having greater variability across the various districts. So rather than having several that are really kind of similar and do the same things, just slightly different, we're going to have a greater variety where there's a much more greater difference between this district and that district as you go up in intensity or down in intensity. We've also looked at consolidating a lot of the old districts into some new districts. And so a lot of things that you'll see in this code, again, we're still changing things a lot, but some things still kind of stay the same as it relates to some of the things. And so the open space district in the proposed code is a consolidation of two of our current districts. So the Parks and Recreation and the Traditional Recreation open space districts, where those two were really kind of doing the same thing. They had the same purpose, they had the same intents, had the same land uses, had the same standards related to those. So why do we have two districts that are doing the same thing? Let's just go ahead and combine them into one that's going to become more effective overall. Similarly, looking at some of these others, such as the Residential 3 district, where really the current RSLD and RSMD, this would be the most equivalent to it, and we'll talk about some of these equivalencies in a minute. Really where those are doing pretty much the same thing, you just have a slight change in what that minimum lot size was. The Water Resources Overlay, again, consolidation of districts where you've got two that pretty much do the same exact thing, so combining those into a better district in terms of how that would be playing out. One of the big changes here with these zoning districts is the deletion textually of a lot of these districts are. And one of the things that we're probably going to see a lot of input, and we have been hearing a lot of input around, and I know this is probably going to be a big concern of council or a big item that your mind is on, is the RU, the rural zoning district. And so we are deleting that textually because ultimately it's not a very effective district in terms of what it's trying to achieve and what it's trying to do. It does cover a large amount of land area in the county currently, but ultimately one way to think about this is we're transforming it into a variety of districts that really try to nail what that RU is trying to do, but breaks it up into the various character elements. So thinking about the AG Agricultural District, the HM Homestead District, the RT Residential Transition District, where you have more appropriate zoning districts for what that area needs and what that area development-wise is trying to do. So rather than being able to have one district where you can have a suburban style cookie cutter kind of development where you're at 3/4 acre lots, and alternatively you can do a 500-acre pig farm right next to it. So where you kind of got that variety that you can automatically do in one, and it's not really achieving what that purpose is trying to achieve. So really
in some ways, that should reduce your number of zoning requests too, should it not?
It should also, yes, sir, in some ways. And a lot of that should also, in general, be taken care of through that mapping process, too, is where we're trying to zone things a little bit more appropriately in relation to the comprehensive plan and those recommendations. But really with this, we're really looking at that RU transforming into 3 different things, even though it's being removed. So ultimately, we stay with 28 districts overall. I believe we have 28 within our current code. We're going to be having 28 going forward. We're just adding some and taking some others away.
Ms. McBride and then Ms. Ramsey.
Yes, ma'am.
Real quick, and if it needs a longer answer, I'll stay afterwards so you can explain to me.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay? So that we can move it forward. With the density-based zoning, remove the minimum lot size standard. If you remove that, does that and retain other size standards? So with the other size standards, you're going to have a minimum and a maximum. Is that why you eliminated it?
So
I'm trying to understand the reason.
And we can talk. I can kind of give you the short answer. We can talk about it a little bit more later. But basically, we're rather than saying you have to have, so you have 100 acres and your minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet. So you can only develop lots that are 10,000 square feet. With this, we're saying you can get. So you've got 100 acres. You want to get 12 units is what you're trying to develop as. You could develop those as 8,000, 9,000 square feet as long as you meet your minimum setback requirements, the building footprint requirements, things like that. So it's
so you're having a mixture of different size houses.
You could have a mixture of different size lots. You could have a mixture of different size houses, those types of things. And so it really just goes back to the flexibility and design of how that area could be developed. And we can go into a little bit more detail till afterwards, but
Thank you.
but your density overall is not going to be changing. So your gross is what your gross is going to be. Mr. Malowski?
Yeah, I had a question on that too, but mine was a little bit different. If you're removing minimum lot sizes, will that not affect the actual setbacks, or will the setbacks still remain in place?
Setbacks will still remain in place, so your minimum setbacks are still going to be from that property line no matter what.
Okay, but in another area here, I saw where setbacks, a lot of them are being reduced.
That's an optional incentive. So
Right, but here's where we've had problems with some of the older neighborhoods. Like Mr. Jim O'Brien came in the other night, still complaining that there's people storing stuff out front, they don't put it out back, they can't get around back to put a larger vehicle or something back there. So they've already got problems in these neighborhoods. We're going to reduce setbacks, so it puts the borders closer to each other, and it makes it even more difficult to keep the front yards clean and have anybody put anything in the backyard. I don't get it. It also reduces the amount of parking that could be available, whereas a lot of complaints that I know I get is there's no parking here. Well, then, are we doing anything to widen the streets so the parking will be available in the streets? I think we need to increase the setback so that we can have parking available off-street. Or, your other option, widen the streets so there's enough room to park in the streets. But we can't give it both ways and then not expect a problem. That's my comment. You can respond later if you want.
We all need that answer.
So we'll go ahead and move forward, because this is a little bit one of the larger sections for this. And so...
Mr. Livingston, just be prepared for council.
We always try our best, Ms. McBride. So here, and Ms. Brown, I'm going to go ahead and apologize in advance if this isn't quite big enough on the screen, but just to give you an example of what the new zoning layout is going to look like. So where we're providing a lot more information on there, providing graphics, providing examples textually, kind of what this thing is, how it should be set up, but also using charts and tables so we can show people, hey, here's what that measurement actually is. Here's how you would find that measurement on the property, or how you would determine that. So this is what that new zoning layout is going to look like, and then contrasting it with what the current layout of that zoning district is, where it's nothing but a plain page with white and black text, and that's what it is. And so one of the ultimate things here is going to really be having a much more user-friendly layout for finding that zoning information. So an individual trying to figure out what their zoning information is, what those standards are, what the different items would entail, they have a much more user-friendly way of figuring those things out. So rather than, just looking at this plain piece of paper and saying, okay, well, my setback standard says on the front it's 25 feet, but really, what does that actually mean in terms of how that plays out with my lot? How does that play out with my house? And so giving a graphic demonstration in the new layout versus just having it as black and white text in the current one.
Well, so while you're removing this minimum lot size, you're still maintaining minimum lot widths.
So
from what I see here,
for certain districts, yes, sir, we are. And then looking at, basically, it becomes kind of an optional removal for certain things. So we still do have that standard in certain districts, yes, sir. Okay. And so here, just wanted to talk a little bit about zoning equivalencies. And so really looking at, again, that this code is a new code. So a lot of the things that we have, may seem similar or may look familiar, but again, we're treating this as being something new. So even where we have zoning districts that were, say, something that we have in the current code, for instance, the general commercial district, we also have a general commercial GC district in the new code. Those are going to be one of those few instances where we have something that is almost exactly the same in terms of the way that the language is set up and the way that that district would look and function. And And so this is really looking at the equivalencies of some of these districts based on kind of the way that you could develop and what kind of that general description of it is. And so again, this is not necessarily going to be an apples to apples thing, and I'm not going to use the other example that Mr. Price generally hates when I provide it. So I'm going to spare you from that. Yes, sir, Mr. Malinowski.
The general commercial, it was several years ago when I had spoken with someone in staff, and I don't want to mention Mr. Price's name, but I was under the impression that as we came along with this new land development code, that we were going to take something like general commercial and have subcategories like we have with the residential, more subcategories, because it would help, I think, the applicant as well as council in making the decision as to whether or not you want to give a particular general commercial category versus we're still at the same place where you want to build a garage to store your antique cars like the fella a month ago came in. He needed general commercial. And it's kind of like, well, if you change your mind or you drop dead, now you've got general commercial, and anything in general commercial can go there. So I think we need to have some subcategories to break that up a little bit.
So I think I understand what you're saying, Mr. Malinowski, and I understand your point, and that's a good thing, and we can go back and take a look at that, and I think that's something we can look at for the future once this kind of is adopted in place, and we can see if we do need to make some of those kind of incremental changes with some of these districts. I will note that within the general development standards for the proposed code, it's going to be section 5.7. It's our neighborhood compatibility standards. So those are going to relate to, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on in the presentation, but those are really going to be one of the things that's going to allow for things like general commercial to be in a variety of different places where they may not always be the most appropriate, but they're going to scale those uses back and allow for a lot more compatibility elements to residential uses. So you're not going to be able to put, say, a giant Walmart in general commercial right up against residential uses. You're going to have to structure it in a much more smaller intensity use where you're not necessarily providing as many impacts to that surrounding residential area. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on those, but I just wanted to go ahead and point that out. The neighborhood compatibility standards is going to be really a key feature that we're looking at with this code related to commercial development adjacent to or nearby residential. And so just, again, looking here, what we're really looking at is, again, equivalencies for really kind of the general description, the character of what those zoning districts would be in relation to the old district and the new district. And so some of these are kind of similar, some of these not so similar, but again, really kind of giving you an idea of what some of those equivalencies look like. Make sure I'm clicking my buttons right. And then again, looking at equivalencies in another way, looking at the equivalencies in densities. So where under the current code, we have a minimum lot size, but we can, from that minimum lot size, develop a density. So I know probably discussions that y'all have had with Mr. Price, a lot of times they'll say, well, yeah, that's a minimum lot size of this, but that relates to this density. And so we just wanted to go ahead and provide that within this chart so you can see what the new density of those proposed districts are as it would relate to that most equivalent district within that old code. And so again, you can kind of see a lot of these densities are similar. Some are less so, some are slightly increased, but those increases are really kind of modest in terms of what they would allow you to do and what the overall purpose and intent for some of those districts are.
Which is which here?
So the left-hand side is going to be the proposed code. The right-hand side is going to be the current code.
Maybe you could put that up there because I'm always looking at it wondering.
So the first one is the recommended proposal.
Yes, ma'am. So the agricultural district has a recommended density of 0.15 dwelling units per acre. So that comes out to being about 7-ish or so acres in terms of what that would potentially look like if you looked at it from a minimum lot size perspective.
And it's 0.15 what per acre?
0 dwelling units per acre. So you would need about 7 acres in order to have that dwelling unit.
Is there any reason we can't just simplify this and for agricultural say 1 unit per 7 acres? Like the homestead, based on that, is 1 unit per
3-ish acres.
3 acres, right?
Yeah, and that's,
And
that's,
rather than have people pull their calculators out every time.
yes, sir, and we can take a look at that language, but it's saying the same thing, as you just mentioned, Mr. Malinowski, but we can take a look at that language-wise and see how that would play out.
But when you go to a meeting, go back to the community meetings, somebody says, well, what can I build on my, 2 acres? Well, you can put .33 homes per acre.
Gotcha.
You figure out what that is.
In other words, Mr. Malinowski is saying, make it plain. Make it plain.
Thank you.
Well, we want to stay professional. So, and I know you probably have certain regulations in the way you write things, so maybe in parentheses or something that you could show it. So can you use the standard?
Yes, ma'am. We can talk amongst ourselves, and there's a couple of ways that we could potentially do that as well. So we'll take a look at it and see if we can come up with something that might work for that. So here, just again, kind of wanted to go through kind of an overview of what those new districts are, what they look like. And so that AG agricultural district that we mentioned is really intended for providing a true rural character, really relating to larger scale working farms that are found throughout the county. So this is not necessarily intended for residential uses. These are going to be your working land. So think farms, think forestry operations, where you're going to be doing a little bit more intense agricultural operations versus just, I live on a bunch of land. That is still that potential that can happen with this, but that's not the overall intention of what it's for. And so, as I mentioned, that density really equates to about a 7-acre size area. And one of the things that we have done with this is provided a district minimum for that district. So you would have to have 35 acres, whether that's AG or homestead, that was a contiguous area. So that way the AG stays a little bit more true in terms of that intent behind it. So you wouldn't be able to have, a property that is 5 acres that becomes AG. And so that's where the homestead district would then come in, where the intent behind it is to then, again, provide another more truly rural zoning district that is more catered towards residential uses. So residential uses on larger tracts of land, but are not necessarily geared towards working farms or things like that. You could still do things along lines of hobby farming and the like, but again, trying to meet that larger acreage residential use in the more rural areas. And so when we think about a true rural setting, the AG and the homestead would be appropriate for those. And then we have the mixed-use districts that are new districts, and these are really looking at helping to support commercial development along corridors and activity centers, so really focusing upon walkability, integration, and mixing of uses at relatively intense scales. And so these two districts would be providing for development type that we historically have not been able to accomplish within the county. And so this is going to be really a significant departure for the style of commercial development that could be occurring with these. Yes, ma'am.
I've spoken with Mr. Price on this before, so I'm not sure this is the right category or not.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes, we have the housing development, low-income housing, and they are always put in areas near railroad tracks. And have you looked at that in your zoning in terms of housing development and the placement of residential?
I would not say affordable housing specifically or low-income housing is specifically. Generally, those are things that you would just look at it as you would other housing in particular. You wouldn't really kind of section that out as a specific use. But we can look at, as it relates to kind of your concern, I think, relating to housing, putting it near railroad tracks. That would be more so a mapping question in terms of how we're looking at some of that. So we can, I think that'd be more so something we can look at then in particular. And that would also be something that could be related to design standards that exist within the general development standards, and also as it relates to these mixed-use districts, they have specific design and form standards that they would have to meet too.
Thank you.
So again, some other new zoning districts that are found within the proposed code. So the employment EMP district and the INS institutional district. And so the EMP is really to help facilitate not economic development, but employment type uses that are more so related to industrial development. So production, manufacturing, and service oriented uses, while still being complementary to more medium and high intensity residential uses and supporting commercial uses. So the INS is more so looking at larger campuses related to educational and civic facilities. So really helps provide a variety of uses relevant to kind of those broader institutional facilities in one district versus having to have a hodgepodge of several different districts that really doesn't have this overall compatibility with it. So if you were having to have, this nuclear research facility as part of your physics program, well, you're probably going to have HI if you were just doing that as a normal thing, but because it's related to, educational research and the like and part of that overall educational campus, well, maybe that's something that you could fit within INS. And so it's really looking at something that, how do you have a compatibility with the surrounding area versus inside as well as outside? And so this is something that would provide for a variety of uses and ensure compatibility with that surrounding area. And then here is a couple of other the new districts. So we do have some new planned development districts that are within the proposed code. And so one is the employment campus, which really here kind of harken back to the kind of the company towns, if you will. So larger economic development or larger economic facilities where you want to have that integration of housing, commercial, and those industrial uses specifically, whether that's a business park or an employment center or things of that nature. This is one of those new districts that could help facilitate some of that. And again, really, this is not necessarily intended for scattered sites, but where you're trying to create a larger kind of employment campus itself. Again, thinking business park or kind of economic center along those lines. And then the traditional neighborhood design, PDT&D, is really looking at creating human-scaled walkable neighborhoods. And so really what that means is providing complete neighborhoods in one, so where you have kind of this kind of town center, a mixture of uses, integrated open space, mixture of housing types, as well as kind of these smaller residential streets throughout that development. And then some other new overlay districts that we have. So one is the neighborhood character overlay. And so this one is going to have limited applicability. And what we mean by that is it would only apply to those areas that have an adopted neighborhood master plan. And so, for instance, the Crane Creek neighborhood master plan area, the Olympia, the Capital City Mill District area plan, those types of neighborhood plans is what this would apply to. So one of the things here, I mentioned the Capital City Mill District plan, so the Olympia area, where it has a variety of historic resources, historic character, historic houses. This is where we would be able to use this zoning district to create new design and form standards for that to help protect those historic resources. And then one of the other new overlays is the military installation overlay, and this looks at providing additional protections and compatibility for places like McIntyre. And we have been working with them closely in terms of getting their input, ensuring that this is meeting their needs for what they're looking at. And the military installation overlay is also a direct outcome of the joint land use study, which was done by all of the bases in the Midlands area that has various recommendations related to those military bases. And so going through some of these changes here, not a whole lot, but one of the big ones that you'll see throughout is this change to general description. And so just kind of refinement on some of the language within the different zoning districts. So rather than terming it purpose and intent, it's more so there to just be this general description of kind of what that district would look like. So kind of wordsmithing a little bit in relation to it. And then kind of starting from that top of that list, adding superseding standards in relation to the cluster development. And so the cluster development is something that's found within the general development standards. And so where we have that being required as an option, that's where you can look at taking advantage, to Mr. Malinowski, your point earlier, that minimum lot size. And so this is where that would come into play as it relates to the zoning districts. And then for the residential transition district, it was missing a minimum lot width for whatever reason. So having to put that in now as part of one of those recommended planning commission changes. And then McIntyre asked us to recommend a variety of changes related to the air base. And so those are found throughout related to the airport height restrictive overlay, as well as the military installation overlay related to really things related to terminology, distance, width, and things related to how they operate and interact. And so they got input from a variety of folks on their base, and we've had several different discussions with them to make sure that, what we were initially proposing were fitting their needs, but also was not going to be impacting them in terms of the viability of those bases. And then, as I mentioned earlier, related to some of that administration stuff, the floodplain overlay was also missing a lot of that information. So Planning Commission recommending those changes that we needed to have to ensure continued compliance with the NFIP. Questions on this article, Mr. Chair? All right, well, I think, all right, so Article 4, going to go through this one. And so this was another one that we see kind of a variety of differences between the old code and the current code. And so really here, we're looking at refining the ultimate organization of the article. So really looking at how things are labeled and how things are set up. And so we see this primarily in relation to a land use hierarchy. So previously, it's just kind of there. And so now we take this more so classification, category, and then type. So that kind of looks at this broader heading of an agricultural use, and then within that, agricultural and forestry, and then that specific type of use. And then from that type, we even get subtypes as it falls to some of their definitions. And so that's one of the big changes that we have with it, and then ultimately looking at revised uses, permissions, and standards. And so one of the big changes here is we are not referencing the NAICS as how we're defining and looking at our land uses. So within our current code, we are using the 2002, so the 2002 North American Industry Classification Standards. That's a little bit out of date, where they're on, I believe, the 2018 version at this point. And so based on what we have, where that use may have been updated within the new NICS version, we're still relying upon the 2002. So one of the things that we've done here is we've deleted the reliance upon the NICS, and all of our land uses are going to be defined specifically within the code. So those are all going to be found within the definition section of Article 9. So Mr. Malinowski, to your question earlier, where those definitions are, we're also going to have the definitions of the land uses that are found within the table. And so another thing here, we have a lot of new land uses. We've also deleted some. And so one of the best examples that we have here that Mr. DeLage really loves to talk about is the video rental store. So when's the last time we saw a Blockbuster? And we don't have any more in the county either. Do we really expect to have any in the county? Probably not. And if we did, it can probably fall under some other use that's better attended to it. And so that's one of the big changes here is deleting uses, but also adding uses that are more appropriate for 2021. So really, a lot of the changes that the Planning Commission recommended were related to the permissions for the principal use table. So if you're looking at that chart of the Planning Commission recommended changes, a lot of those were what this is. And so really what happened there was the Homestead District didn't have the right permissions for a lot of those land uses, but because it was a substantive feature, so whether something was going to be permitted outright or permitted by special requirement, we couldn't necessarily consider that a Scribner error. And so that's what a lot of these recommended changes related to Article 4 are. And then kind of separate from it is some of the standards for certain land uses. So really looking at where we needed to make some additional refinements, additional changes, or move around some uses. So for instance, paintball and airsoft as a subtype, currently within the land development code, it falls under shooting range. Well, we felt it was more appropriate for that to fall under commercial recreation, so similar to a go-kart track, a batting cage, or things like that, versus a shooting range. So a lot of what those kind of use standards are for certain land uses, yes, they relate to the HM district, but there are some other specific things for some of those kind of subtypes of uses. So any questions here, Mr. Chair? All right, well, I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. DeLage to walk us through the general development standards.
Thanks, Mr. Brooks. Can I get the...
Yes.
Thanks, sir. All right, so with this particular section, we're getting into essentially, after the rezoning process, when they want to submit in, subdivision plans or building plans, these standards are going to apply. So you can think of the sections that are red text. Those are new changes added to the code versus the medium blue you can kind of think of as existing standards that we've had that we've modified some kind of way, either with best management practices, additional language. And then the light blue is kind of some other revisions as well, but maybe minor modifications. So it's going to address a lot of different things, but I'm going to touch on a lot of these independently with their own slides. Yes, sir, Mr. Malinowski.
Where will we find the full details for the red text portions? Is that something you're sending out to us?
So, yes, sir, and it should be in the marked up versions as well, and the older version of the code. And these are different sections within Article 5, but I'm going to kind of go through these. You
say the older. I got an April 2021.
So I think one way to clarify that, Mr. So in terms of the red thing, these are going to be sections within this article that's severely different from the current code. So not necessarily major changes from one draft to the other, but a significant difference or don't even exist within the current code is what the red ones would be. Does that clarify, Mr. Malinowski? Okay.
All right, so getting into access and mobility, connectivity, again, this is some new standards that the consultant staff has identified. Right now, currently, you can have very long cul-de-sacs within subdivisions. The cul-de-sac lengths are going to be reduced. Also, as part of that, there's a requirement for certain connectivity. So that connectivity index, which is on the corner of the screen, is essentially kind of showing how it maps out. You look at the different nodes and links, and it will provide certain standards for those blocked links. And the idea is so that you don't get a subdivision anymore that is essentially a giant cul-de-sac with cul-de-sacs coming off of it. The idea is to add for some connectivity, also planning for that adjacent future use. So if you've got an undeveloped residential or an undeveloped commercial site next to you, as part of that, you'll need to plan to connect. Another reason why we identified this as an issue is you have some subdivisions, and some of this is dependent upon the fire code as well. They may have one entrance in and out, and they may have an emergency entrance for a fire truck, but they could be right next door to another development that they now have to get out and go onto a major road off of a local road to access, and instead this would have provisions for allowing for them to connect internally. And then the cross-access also for commercial developments is a new one. And again, the intent behind that is so you don't have a commercial use that's adjacent to another commercial use, and then you have to automatically go onto a major road just to access a door or a site that's next door. And then also the pedestrian connection. So for some of these newer subdivisions that would be coming through, or even commercial, if there is a sidewalk or some kind of access to some kind of pedestrian pathway, providing for that access internally. So again, you don't have to walk from the back end of the subdivision at the cul-de-sac all the way down to the front to the major road just to get to a sidewalk.
Just for a moment, I want to be clear. You said the lighter blue, which is the first three bullets. were existing with minor changes?
That's correct. So,
I think those are the moderate changes. Those in the darker blue, those don't really see, those just see kind of minor refinements. The medium blue, so those three at the top, those see some moderate changes.
Okay.
Red is either entirely new or major differences from the current code. And then the medium blue, so that, I guess that would be the lighter blue in this case. So those top three, those would be moderate differences.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, Ms. Aaron.
thank you, Mr. Crooks. All right, so
Sorry, Tommy.
getting into off-street parking standards. So, of course, there's been some changes over the years to different uses, different standards for parking requirements. Also, you've got different types of materials that can be used that maybe weren't thought of when the 2005 code came out. One of the things that we've looked at doing is updating the standards for like our minimum and maximums. Looking at a way for how to kind of also provide for adequate off-street parking, but to provide alternatives for, businesses that may be able to operate without having to do a sea of parking. Also, for mixed uses, currently the way we have it, we have a one-size-fits-all for our mixed-use parking calculations. With these new standards, it kind of gets actually into the uses, so again, you get the more appropriate amount of parking required. And then for our larger parking lots, so thinking of your large-scale commercial retailers or industrial sites, looking at different standards for that, so again, you don't end up with a sea of parking. There's also some flexibility, so, if you have a business you have 30% of your workforce works from home, you're on a bus route, you have access to Uber or other rideshare programs, you're on a road that has a dedicated bike path, you can use that to be able to defer some of that required parking, so you'd be able to reduce it. You also would have to maintain a plan that has to be updated yearly and submitted to staff as part of that, but again, providing for some of that flexibility. Also looking at stacking spaces, so your stacking spaces are pretty much anything for use that has a driveway, so I'll use a notorious one now, Chick-fil-A. They have a lot of stacking space built in because of their dual driveways. So basically we're updating our standards for those drive-through uses. Also for bicycle parking, currently in the code it's kind of all over the place for those requirements. So we have consolidated that and then also refined some of the language. And then again, that transportation demand management, it's getting into those areas that have access to basically multimodal transportation.
This applies to businesses.
Yes, ma'am. So
okay, so did we check with looking at economic development and the impact that it may have? We discussed these issues with them.
So they have been part of our stakeholder group. They're identified with other government stakeholders as well. So they've received a copy of this, but of course we can always reach out to double check to see. We don't send them a lot of stuff all the time because we try not to inundate them, but this is one that, again, that would be very important.
This does not include garages. This is just for parking lots.
Correct. So if you're coming in for a
I just wanted to make sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard to see it.
Sorry, it's hard to see. All right, so for landscaping, right now, currently, we don't identify a lot of species. We kind of talk about small, large, maturing trees. And then we don't have a diversity requirement. So sometimes you get a site and I'll pick on dogwoods. They might have a bunch of dogwood trees as part of their landscape. And well, instead with this, it's going to specify that you have to have a certain number of shrubs and they have to be different. So that's also going to help potentially with disease. So if one gets a disease, it's not going to wipe out all your required landscaping. We've also looked at those, the transition yard buffers, try to simplify those, make them a little bit easier to understand. Now there's a chart that is kind of based off of the use, and then the use defines it based off of square footage, and then that's kind of how you get into your buffer yards. We've also looked at trying to refine the requirements for street protected yards, and then those parking lot landscaping standards as well. We've also added new minimum plantings, that it kind of gives more specificity to what those landscaping requirements are. But also the idea is, again, to provide code language that is going to make the landscaping that's required more of a screening, more of a separation, and rather than having maybe just a few plantings here or there, and it really doesn't meet the intention of what it's supposed to do. Also looking at tree protection standards. So currently that is based off of a certain diameter at breast height. We've kind of stretched that out, so it's not only looking at large trees, it's looking at the species of tree, so that may not get up to that large diameter, but still should be protected because it provides some kind of function. Any questions?
Chair, I may be recognized. Mr. Chair. Mr. DeLage, as far as the landscaping maintenance and, I guess, species diversity standards, does the standards apply to, is that part of like neighborhood development as well, or is this commercial, or you're just, or is this shrubbery along the roadside? Exactly what are we getting at when you say landscaping maintenance and species diversity standards, and where that applies in the county?
Yes, sir, Mr. Walker. So if it's part of a residential subdivision development, typically that would apply towards your up front, like where your street is between the highway or the road that is not the local road that's servicing the internal subdivision. That being there's certain widths that are required now. So it mainly what you think of as common area in subdivisions, or if you had a very intense or high intensity residential next to maybe a 2 or 3 acre lot subdivision, you would have some, plantings within there, but it wouldn't be an individual homeowner's lot. And then again, for commercial and industrial, so anytime if an industrial use is located next to like a retail use, or, there's some other nuances in there, but typically they'd have to provide some kind of screening, some kind of vegetation. Also parking areas, so you're screening for that. The idea is technically, if a parking area would be visible from a public road or right-of-way, you try to screen that. Also, your shade trees, for the idea of being that within a certain radius of those parking spaces, there should be a large enough canopy tree that would provide some relief from basically all that impervious surface heating up that's being directly exposed. I'll pick on Walmart because they have very large parking lots with not a lot of trees. So, but those are some of the instances that would apply to.
DeLage, I need to think more in terms of, I guess, common areas as opposed to individual lots with respect to, the landscape and maintenance standards that's you all are proposing, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, and then open space set-aside. So right now, beyond just those areas, kind of like what we were talking about earlier about having your required buffers or in potential common areas, the open space is a option. So you would typically do open space if you want to receive credit to get relief from setbacks or lot size, or potentially to even get a density bonus. Well, now, since a lot of developments are taking advantage of that, which we've identified that we should require that in every development now. So now there are minimum mandatory open space set-asides for any new development. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they automatically, by doing those minimum open space requirements, get a density bonus. So they have to do more on top of that. So we've also looked at as far as for standards that would address design and configurations for certain developments. So a prime example you can kind of see from the open space set-aside configuration, that's figure 26-5.4. The idea is to make sure that you're not having, a strip of open space, here, a little tiny unusable piece of open space, across the development. It's to kind of make that useful and to put them together so they're not disjointed. Also, we clarify requirements for maintenance and ownership. So the idea being that ultimately an HOA or a POA or some other organization other than the county would be responsible for making sure that stuff is maintained. And then also we had some of the standards for those natural features included as part of your open space set-asides from the previous code, our current code. We're carrying those forward as well. And then some of those examples down there on the bottom right are looking at kind of your landscape areas. They talk about the tree protection areas. You're looking at any kind of passive recreation, and then natural features, so floodplain, if you have creeks, any kind of natural features that are on the site. Yes, sir, Mr. Malley.
Is this a typo in this book here back, I've got it in the definitions on 9-49. Open space is mentioned twice, given two different numbers, 1041, 1042, but they say exactly the same thing.
Which page, Mr. Malinowski?
I've got it in 9-49 in the book I have.
It's probably a typo then if it's in there twice.
Or I didn't know if I'm missing something.
Open space. Okay, that's probably a typo. So in the most recent draft, it'd be on page 9-52, and it's only listed once.
Oh, okay.
All right. Then we have the cluster development, which is new, and this was put into place to make sure that we, when they're developed in certain areas, so you can mainly think of this as in the more rural or low-density suburban areas of the county, that the development is appropriate contextually, and then the character, it fits in with it, so it's not such a stark, kind of difference between land uses. So idea being that is with this cluster development, you would be able to develop maybe a very low density residential subdivision in a more rural part of the county, but you're not going to go drive down the highway and all of a sudden see the backs of a bunch of homes from the road. It's also a way to reduce costs for infrastructure. So, if you've got a 100-acre site and you can do one dwelling unit per acre rather than developing all 100 acres, with having water, sewer, roads, drainage, you're able to actually kind of shrink those down. You won't get above 100 units, but you would be able to reduce the length of impervious surfaces and your infrastructure for those. Also, again, that buffering and screening, the cluster development provisions are intended to make sure that you shouldn't be able to, again, from a road or adjacent property, tell that there's a subdivision utilizing this cluster development. Again, intended to kind of fit into place. Some places call them a conservation subdivision is another term for it, but it can be used for that purpose as well.
That's a quick question on that one. Although you can't build on all that green space on the bottom one there, what are limited uses? How can you, ballpark, what can you use that for?
So those, as far as the area that is part of the cluster development, I mean, that does include additional, I would say, passive recreational uses. That's probably actually a good question for applying it as part of a test case, is how it may work for, say, a ball field or something like that. The intent wouldn't be to put any kind of structures within there. It'd be more or less to be either some kind of passive recreation or green space, natural space. So ideally, if you had a site with a lot of trees or is wooded, you would not disturb more than what you would need as far as for the residential development. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't include some kind of feature that would be considered common space, or what you would think of as common recreation.
That was my point, is that would have to almost be used as common space in some means. Okay.
Mr. Chair, may I speak on that matter? Maybe, thank you, sir. Eric Jensen, Assistant County Administrator for the record. Very briefly, I've done many of these, and I've written many of these codes. In fact, I did transfer of development right codes with Mr. Arendt, with this gentleman whose image they're using here in the state of Utah. And so let me give you a little more background on what you can do with these. So essentially, in a conservation or cluster subdivision, the land that is not developed or that is not put into the particular use, because you can do these with industrial, you can do this with all different kinds of uses, can be used for just about anything that you put into your code. So it can be active agriculture. We did that in some areas. It can be passive recreation. It can be just about anything that you, as a legislative body, feel is appropriate for that space. Because essentially what you are doing, you are effectively transferring the development from that area to another area so that there's no net change in the number of dwelling units or square footage of development or however you use your unit calculations. And then the remaining land, again, can be put to whatever purpose you feel is appropriate. So, again, depending on what it is, if it's a piece of ground, and let's just say that there's a natural pond on, 5 acres out of 100, and the developer says, well, what I really want to do is I just want to drain that pond, and I want to put more houses on it. And you, in your wisdom, say, that is not what we're looking for. What we want that natural pond to stay there indefinitely in perpetuity, and so we're going to make you put a conservation easement over the top of this ground, and within that conservation easement, we are going to put criteria of what this land can and cannot be used for. That is one thing that you can do, and we actually do that here through our conservation division. We actually buy and place conservation easements on land all throughout the county that we think is of some particular importance, has a value that we have decided as a community is worth preserving. So you can do that with these subdivisions. It just depends on the situation, the context, and what that remaining land, what community values or community resources are available on that land.
What I was really getting at is trying to figure out what will the developer be able to do on that land without further permission.
Correct, and that is what exactly. And what I'm saying is the council will need to determine that when you approve this subdivision. You will need to say this land is restricted for this use, and this use, and nothing else.
That's what I'm getting at, yeah.
Yes, and so what I'm saying is that, again, depending on the scope, the size of the subdivision, depending on its location, depending on what resources naturally exist, you will need to determine. And you can put in your code just some generic language that just says that once the development is transferred off of that to this other area or clustered, that no kind of development other than X, Y, Z. And then you can just make standard ones if you want. Or you can be specific to, again, the community and the resources that are available.
That was my concern.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, I just want to just make sure that I'm clear.
Yes.
So we would, I guess, we'll determine what goes on that green space at the time of rezoning, if it comes before us, or should it be identified at this moment while we're doing this land development rewrite? What can be by a cluster? What cannot be by a cluster? Is that what I hear you saying, that we need to determine that during this process?
Thank you, Councilwoman. Again, Eric Jensen, ACA, for the record. The answer is you have both options. You may put into your code specific criteria that say if this type of subdivision comes into effect, these are the only things that can be done with that. You can put that in your code right now, or you can make it specific to every development. You can say that, the developer may say to you, for example, this ground or this community really needs a pool and needs of this and needs of that, and I want to put that in this space. And you may say, great, that's a great use for it. But then you also may say, no, you know what? This land needs to be preserved as it is and not disturbed because of its historic nature, whatever. And so you have that ability, but you need to decide how you want to do it. Do you want to just have generic language in your code that just says, hey, the land that is not being the housing is not being placed on, or not buildings aren't being placed on, can only do X, Y, Z, and that's it. And then that's good, because what it does is it tells the developer up front, hey, this is what you can do with that land. And then they know and they can plan for it and everything. But it may tie your hands because, again, let's just say that this is a historic farm and there's historic structures on it. And you want to preserve those historic structures. And maybe that doesn't fit with your generic code of leaving structures on the land. So that's something that you need to discuss, and you need to know up front what you want to be able to do and what you don't want to be able to do. What predictability do you want, and what flexibility do you want?
So my question would be, staff, when you put this in place, what was your intent?
Yeah, I think the intent was,
I don't think it's on.
no, what's on, sorry. I think the intent was for you to identify that now. As subdivisions do not come before council, and again, what we don't want to make a mistake of is essentially contractually rezoning property, by design. So in this particular case, I think that we can look at conservation areas, open space areas, and we can kind of further define those. And I think, again, there are a number of things that, I really wish I could sit here, and I hope Brian doesn't get on me for this, but I really wish we could just say, this is gonna be the perfect code right now. But there are gonna be some things that as we go forward, and I think one of the mistakes that we have probably made over the years, we just don't address it right away. We see, let's deal with it right now. And so I think that one of the things that Brian mentioned earlier is we want to start using our planning commission differently, more than just recommendations on map amendments. But these are things that should go to them, that they should work with staff to kind of create this kind of language, to see what needs to go into these particular areas, and then bring that back to you. So, but to go answer your question, this is something that we should deal with that was in the code right now, because these won't come back to you as council.
And Ms. Barron, short answer to your initial question, so it is addressed in the code now. It's everything that's preserved, and I guess this is also part to your question, Mr. Chair, what it would be one of the open space set-aside features. And so that's a brevity of things that could occur. And to Mr. Jensen's point, I think there's a lot of things that he mentioned that I think we would love to do further down the line. And those are things that we've got on our list to try to explore and things like that. And so, I think it all kind of coincides together with policy implementation that we're trying to do from the comp plan related to this code, related to other elements and things like that. But short answer to y'all's question, it would be one of those things within the open space set-asides, the way it's currently written.
Right when the iron's hot.
So that 26-5.4D, that table. So it would be one of those things that fall within it.
I'll ask you again.
Thank you. Mr. Price, I'm really sorry to hear you say that, kind of like the guy that thought he wrote the perfect country western song. You're telling us this isn't the perfect code that we're writing here. But even knowing that, is this going to be a requirement in these subdivisions, cluster development?
So the short answer is only when they would apply. So for certain districts, not every subdivision that will come in will be a cluster development, but it will be a tool in the toolbox that someone could use potentially if it were to come into, a character or an appropriate context. Again, these are more intended for the more rural and undeveloped areas of the county. Not thinking out like, at the very end of the county or, McCord's Ferry Road, but somewhere in between, where it's appropriate.
Okay,
but
thank you.
Open space will be required in all residential subdivisions, so.
Just a quick question, again, this is something we can talk about after.
Based on what you're saying, we're going to specify that there are options that they would have.
I believe so, yes, ma'am, Ms. McBride. So if they do this cluster development, that area that they're preserving, that has to it has to become one of these things.
Yeah,
that's the open
things.
space set-aside. Yes, ma'am.
And then listening to what the other presentation said, we could have it where as council, we could look at the needs of the requester and to determine which is best fit. Right, so that's an option we need to deal with, right, when it comes back before us.
I think so. Okay. I think
my
you might have lost me there for a second, but as always, yes, ma'am. If that's another thing we need to discuss, yes, ma'am. We can definitely have that discussion. All right.
Go ahead.
All right, so getting into kind of what we had touched on a little bit earlier is these design and form standards for certain districts and uses. The idea is to encourage a little bit better quality development, so not so much as your cookie cutter commercial. This applies to all of the mixed use districts. So, and the idea is to provide some form to the code, whereas kind of you can think of our current code now as very Euclidean. Our new code is there's some form-based elements. It's kind of a hybrid that we worked into it. So it's going to look at how your facades are, your spacing between buildings, kind of the pitch and angles of roofs, the transparency. And the idea behind this is to get better quality development. And I'm not going to pick on any particular site, but again, with these mixed-use districts, the idea is to be innovative, almost kind of by right like a PDD, but also to provide some specifications to those that are making, an application to do some kind of a mixed-use development, which kind of leads into our next thing, getting into the neighborhood compatibility standards. This is another development standard that will come into play when you have existing neighborhoods. So think of, I'll pick on Decker Boulevard. If you're familiar with Decker Boulevard, you've got a commercial corridor, but immediately on either side, you've got residences. So the idea would be that in a case of, say, they were to come in, redevelop a piece of property, the standards would make sure that they're not going to develop a 3-story house next to a, 1-story, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house, so it's a completely out of character development. Also, think of it as, so maybe you get a mixed-use development, but it butts up to a residence. Well, you don't want an outdoor patio for a restaurant, backing up to the rear yard of a residential use, playing music until 2 a.m. So it provides some standards for the locations, potential hours of operation of certain uses. Again, being the idea that if you were to have this kind of commercial development next to an existing neighborhood, it should be harmonious. It shouldn't have any of those conflicts with it. Also thinking of it makes recommendations for gradual transition. So again, if you look at the figure that's in the bottom behind there, it'll have standards about, so you don't get that kind of commercial building that you see on the corner right next to a residence. It kind of steps up the development as you get closer to the residence, or further away from the residence, but closer to the residence. It should be contextually appropriate. And then this is true for the agricultural compatibility standards as well. So the idea is to be protecting those existing working farms. We're not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing if, farmer A sells their land and, of course, maybe their kids don't want to farm, so it gets redeveloped, but farmer B wants to stay, keep on farming. Well, typically what happens down the road is as residents move in, you hear complaints, noise, odor, dust. So the idea behind the agricultural compatibility standards would be, okay, if you want to develop on Farmer A's lot, you're going to need to have some buffers built in. So you're not quite smelling that fresh manure in the morning. Or you're not getting a bunch of dust from them when they're planting the fields. Also looks like it also has another kind of gradation. So your larger lots are going to be near your agricultural buffer. And then as you move away, you can get down to whatever the density and lot district standards are that allows for those. But again, up front, you're also going to have some buffering and some open space. So you're not going to be driving down the road, and next thing you know, you're looking at someone's backyard in the back of a residence from that primary street. All right, and then the green development incentives. So this is new. Currently, our code looks at certain standards as far as for your incentives for, again, reducing lot size or increasing density. Most of it's relating to setting aside certain features. In this case, we add in certain resource-efficient technologies as a incentive to maybe be able to get some of those released from code as far as for your building standards. These incentives are things that could be related either to energy-efficient technologies, use of certain standards. So the Building Industry Association has a CHIP tool that the city currently uses, and that's where they get certain credit for using energy-efficient washing machines, energy-efficient dishwashers, things of that nature. And as part of that, you can look at increasing potentially building height, residential density, lot area, parking standards, and then again the setback requirement. Typically, to get certain incentives, you're going to have to meet those specific inclusions from multiple categories. So you just can't say, okay, well, I've got a energy efficient HVAC, now give me another dwelling unit per acre. You're going to have to do that. You may have to look at, ways to capture stormwater, ways to reuse gray water, cisterns, a combination of a number of different resources to be able to achieve that. Yes, sir, Mr. Malnes.
I'm sorry, you're...
Thank you. Is there a list somewhere that shows us what these resource-efficient technologies are so that the developer knows what they are? It's just somewhere in a book, I guess, that I don't have.
Yeah, so it should
Or
be
maybe
under-
I didn't see that.
Can't see that.
It's gonna be table 26-5.13E, Mr. Malinowski. 26-5.13E, and it's gonna be green building features. So in the Planning Commission recommended draft, that's gonna be page 5-163.
Okay, and, well, without knowing what they are, I don't understand why you would give somebody an increase in the residential density, especially if the code's going to say no more homes than this many per acre.
Yeah, and as far as the increase in the density, it would never get it, kind of similar to what it is now, it would never get it to where it would be considered like almost like a map amendment. It would never get to the next zoning district standard. It would only be a percentage of the current district standard. But the idea behind it, again, would be that if you were to look at it, it wouldn't be, you couldn't tell that there was an extra 0.25% dwelling units within the development.
You're saying, and tell me if I'm hearing you wrong, if we've got 10 homes per acre, and you're saying the next standard is 20 per acre, it won't reach the next one, but it could be 18 per acre.
It would be looking more like probably 2 or 3. It would be the intent behind it, versus, and it's intended more to get you to the growth that you're actually allowed by code, more so than getting you, more. In theory, you could. It depends on how innovative you are with your site design.
Yes, I'm not understanding why, because you put in an energy efficient refrigerator or dishwasher, that would entitle you to build 2 more homes.
And you would have to do more than that, but I mean, that's a potential option. In our categories, some incentives count more than that. So typically, and if I'm not mistaken, correct me, I think that's in category B.
It depends on it. It could be an A.
So,
it could be a C
but
or B.
the idea is that you would have to do multiple of those in order to get any of those incentives, and you can't stack them. So if you do, say, 2 incentives that meets the requirement that allows for an increase in residential density, you can't then say, I also want to use those for a reduction of my minimum setbacks. You'll have to do more incentives to be able to get that as well.
Yeah. And again, Mr. Brown, this is also something that, if council as a whole does not feel like that we should be providing an incentive for increasing the allowable density, I mean, that's a policy decision that council can make as part of the adoption of the code.
Okay, I see where you directed me to on that 5.13E.
Mm-hmm.
However, the 5-163, you said that was a planning commission report or something?
So it's just the specific draft of the public hearing text. So there's the regular public hearing text, and then there's the planning commission recommended draft of the public hearing text. So April 2021 draft versus the one that was provided to council back in July.
At April 2021, so that's what this 5-163 is referring to?
The table's going to generally be the same, yes, sir. There's going to be some slight differences.
And that's the most recent one you handed us, right?
The one from July would be the most recent one.
The most recent one I got is April.
Okay. Do you have the cover, Mr. Malinowski? Is there a little...
The cover says April 2021.
Okay. I will check and make sure that you have the right, but the one that we handed out at the July zoning public hearing meeting should be the most recent draft. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, in the bottom right-hand corner, it should be in red lettering, Planning Commission recommended draft, June 2021 clean
Did it
copy.
come in that green folder like that?
They passed it out to us at a meeting. It looked just like, Mr. Walker's. That's how they gave it to us.
I have two copies. I have the copy that Mr. Malinowski has, and I have the copy that you just referenced, Mr. Crooks.
Right,
So,
yeah.
actually, they both have the red, I believe, Mr. Malinowski, but one, the dates are different. I think the first is like April.
Yeah, there's one from April.
Is that red?
and-
Okay.
Okay. Well, Mr. Brown, we'll make sure we get you a copy, either way. Mr. Brown, the digital, the email I sent you this morning, it does have that digitally too, but I'll print you a new one and make sure we get it to you as quick as we can.
Quick question. Is this in any way related to global warming, in terms of resources using technology?
In part, so it would be looking to make sure that we have more resource efficient, and the same way that, you know, you're being rewarded for doing these green practices. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chair, may I be recognized?
Right, please.
Thank you, sir. Again, Eric Jensen, ACA, for the record. Mr. Malinowski, to answer your question more directly, sometimes communities have goals and aspirations that they want to implement, but they can't do it mandatorily. And so they create incentives, and so that is all this is. This is just one where you as council can pick a value or something important that you want to see accomplished, and you can say, we will give you half a unit extra if you do this thing that we cannot require of you, but that we think is important. And so that's essentially what this is. Nothing more, nothing less. And so the Planning Commission says, we think that it is of value to this community that we promote energy efficiency. And so we're saying that we're going to reward you with X, Y, Z for promulgating or promoting this particular community aspiration. So that's all this is. And of course, council, in your discretion, you can decide what you want to reward them with, or you can say, you know what, this is a tool we don't even want to use. So that's all it is.
Tell me, will you advance? So just quickly, wanted to look at what those planning commission changes were. And so some of these are really kind of, they're really kind of minor in terms of what those changes look like. So the required development access points, so just changing the tier values a little bit. So rather than it being 80 and 160, it'd be 100 and 200. And then that third tier was, rather than saying 3 for no matter what, it's up to the discretion of the county engineer, the fire marshal, and or SCDOT, depending on who controls that road. So the fire marshal could say, well, we need you to have 5 access points, or you could just need 2. And so that would really just be dependent upon that approving authority at that point. For the minimum street connectivity index that Tommy mentioned earlier, the Homestead District was missing in that language. And so as part of that, we also wanted to look at reducing the score for the RT and the R1. So where it was 1.35, we felt 1.3 was more appropriate. Reducing the planning strip for sidewalks from 3 feet to 1.5 feet. And then looking at clarifying language for when a traffic impact assessment is. So there was some vague language in relation to it related to all roads or county roads, and so clarifying that language. And then for the open space set-asides that Mr. DeLage mentioned, so grouping the R2 zoning district with the R3 through the R6 districts, as it's kind of more incompatible with it versus the others that it was in there. And then also clarifying language in relation to what exactly a wildlife habitation determination and woodlands specifically were under those natural features versus the language that we had. Tommy, if you'll go forward for me. And then some of these other additional ones. So adding the cluster development as a specific optional requirement for the other residential districts besides those that it was required of. And then for the neighborhood compatibility standards, there was an exemption that said if a right-of-way was greater than 75 feet, those neighborhood compatibility standards would not apply. Well, if you look at most of the right-of-ways within the county, they're generally 75 feet is kind of that standard. So it really wouldn't be applicable anywhere. So removing that exemption for that right-of-way length. And then, as we kind of talked about earlier, the green development incentives. So looking at the increase in density, originally in the public hearing draft before the Planning Commission, it was at 5%. Planning Commission noted that it should be 25 for most of the residential districts and the mixed-use districts, and then 30% in those lower intensity residential districts. And then adding additional incentives and modifying how that schedule looks. So what those incentives were and how much of a, I guess, value those incentives were worth. So any questions on those changes? Yes, ma'am, this is Brett.
Yeah, so they're recommending an almost 1/3 increase of homes in these AG, HMRT, and R1 districts.
So, yes, sir, a 30% increase into the allowable density that you could have. So if you're at, so in the AG, it would be 0.15 times 0.3 plus 0.15. You go from 0.15 to 0.195 would be the maximum density that would be allowed at that point. So you're going from...
How about give me an acreage? You got 10 acres, or 7, whatever your minimum is.
You gain about a unit.
I don't get it.
Yeah. So
It seems like everything that's being written here is geared for increasing the densities constantly. All right, thank you.
So Mr. Mellon, so give you another example, at least using the R2. In R2, the base density is 3, you'd be able to get 25%. So if, say, you've got 1 acre, all the max allowable density was already 3, you go to 3.25, you're still only going to be able to get three units for that 1 acre.
Okay, I'd like to then see these things as examples written out as to what happens, and maybe I could understand it better then.
We can get you that, yes, sir.
And, of course, that's only for 3 acres versus, like it was mentioned earlier, somebody comes in and they've got 300 acres.
Yeah,
What happens there?
Yeah, we can provide you different examples using different acreages. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Could you just,
And I'm done.
could you get that information for all of us?
Yes,
And then
ma'am,
at
we
some
can do that.
point
We'll send it out to everybody.
We can have an explanation,
When we have
because
it,
it does appear that we're just packing more and more people in, and I want to make sure that I understand that point. Now, for the planting strip for sidewalks, reduced to 1.5, what is the planting strip? How is that different? We're not reducing the size of the sidewalk. We're just doing the planting.
yes, ma'am.
strip.
So that would
Okay, I
be,
just wanted to make
so
sure about that.
you got your curb and gutter, you got your strip of grass or the area where your tree would be, and then you've got your sidewalk or whatever else. So just reducing that, the area that would need to also, one, be maintained, one, to be installed. So you're cutting down on what that overall maintenance cost would be in part. But yeah, just what that area between curb and gutter and sidewalk, what that area would be. All right, Tommy, if you want to go forward. So, sorry, I don't want to steal your thunder. So Article 6, Land Development Subdivision Standards. So this is going to really be an area where we don't see too many major differences. The big differences here is really going to be related to, just need to comply with the new zoning standards, the general development standards, and then the land development manual, which I believe y'all may have gotten some information about that last week or either this week at your meetings. Tuesday. I believe there's a presentation by Ms. Williams and Mr. Staley. And so it just references the need to comply with the LDM. And then one of the other kind of bigger differences from the current code to the proposed code is we've decreased the size of the required block length. So where it was a relatively large number, we're shortening what those lengths of what those blocks can be for the minimum and the maximum of those sizes. But otherwise, in terms of, the land development or the subdivision of land, what those things are, we're generally carrying those forward as they are. Tommy. And no changes recommended by the Planning Commission for that. And then Article 7 is going to be our nonconformities article. And so what this does is centralizes all the language regarding nonconformities into one article. And one of the big things here is going to be looking at adding flexibility for parking and landscaping standards. So how do properties conform with that when they have an alteration or expansion of a structure. So other kind of things that relate to this, so, what is considered things that are grandfathered, how do things work, but then also what, when you have a change of use, when you have an alteration, when you have an expansion, those types of things that would trigger bringing an element into conformity, this article addresses those. And I don't believe any planning commission recommendations related to this one. Tommy, if you'll, the next one. And then Article 8, enforcement, and this pretty much is what it sounds like. So it's the procedures for enforcing the land development code. So notes what is considered required compliance, what constitutes a violation, who are the responsible parties for violations, and then what the ultimate remedies and penalties for violations are. And so a lot of this is kind of the similar language that we have within the current code, similar language that we have throughout the other areas of county code of ordinances as well. But this is just your general enforcement language for the code. And no recommended changes by the Planning Commission here. And then Article 9, so this is really an article that sees a pretty fair amount of differences between the current code, and really this relates back to that overall user friendliness. And so a lot of these things were previously at the beginning of the code, so in our current code, all of these things are kind of at the front. We've kind of moved them into the back now because it makes a little bit more sense to have them there. You're not flipping 150 pages before you actually get to anything that you're trying to find. And so now they're kind of at the back. And so this looks at the definitions, the rules of construction, and rules of measurement. And rules of construction is really just how are terms defined, how are you looking at those types of things. And then the rules of measurement is going to be how are we actually doing the measurement of these certain things. And so points to note here is this provides how delegation of authority works for professional level staff. So where we have something that's noted as the zoning administrator, that may not always necessarily be the zoning administrator that's doing that review, handling that paperwork. It's going to be some professional level staff in a lot of cases. We have a lot more graphically rich document now. So you note on the screen some different examples. So we have specific graphic examples now versus just verbally saying, here's what this thing is. And then within this section, we also define what exactly are variations for certain measurements. And then at the end, where we have all of our definitions. So if there's a specific term or a specific land use within the article or the code as a whole, those things will be defined within the definition section. So if you're looking for a land use, you want to know what exactly is this thing, you flip to the definition section, and that'll be where you find it. We did have a couple of Planning Commission changes recommended here. Those were primarily related to what those definitions are, and those were really things that were either missing, needed refinements, or were necessary for the actual enforcement implementation of the code itself. So just things that were really kind of missing or weren't there. Any questions?
I'd like to recognize.
Thank you, sir. I didn't see it in the version I was looking at, and it may be in the other, but maybe in the definitions you could put constrained and unconstrained, please.
Okay.
Thank you. This has been very helpful. Is there an area in the code that would this be in another section regarding lighting?
So lighting for individual properties is in this code, yes, ma'am. So we don't do street lighting in relation to this. We would only do things related to individual properties or business developments, things like that. Those.
Not the development, residential development.
So in terms of what lighting would need to be provided as part of that, I'm not the expert on that section, but I believe it is in part addressed. I'm going to let Mr. DeLage answer that more specifically.
And I can talk to you afterwards, and you can point me to the direction where I can read it, and I may have questions about it later.
Yes, ma'am, we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, the short answer is yes, it does address it. It just doesn't necessarily get into individual lots. So if you're a lot kind of, and you might have been subdivided out, but you're not part of a formal subdivision, it wouldn't necessarily address that. But for
we're talking about the subdivision.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
I've reached that time. I think we were scheduled for 2 hours. If there's no final questions, I just want to thank staff. For me, this has been extremely helpful, and to put it in this one document, I think, this is extremely comprehensive. It's gonna drastically change a lot of what we're doing in our county. So I appreciate what you're doing with this, because I understand what a major task this is.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure I point out, I know, Mr. Malinowski kind of dominated the questions, but if any of the council members have any further questions, sometimes these things pop in your head later on, we just ask that you please reach out to staff. I think y'all have our contact information, just maybe the simple question you just want us to look into. We'll be more than happy to look into it, and if you need any other things addressed, maybe another quick presentation or something, please let us know. We'll be happy to provide it to you.
Thank you. Any other questions, anything from my colleagues? I certainly enter the motion to adjourn then.
So move. Second.
It's moved in proper second to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. The meeting's adjourned. Again, thank everyone.
We adjourned, we're done. Are you leaving imminently? I was just gonna come and ask you, I'm gonna see if I have an extra one. I'll look, maybe with all the paper, I go home here, cover it with something else, but.